Okay, I'm gonna go back to the mediators a little bit because I know you study a lot about mediators. What are the things that the people being mediated care about when they're selecting for? Why do they agree to an outside mediator? What are they looking to get from somebody else coming in and mediating their conflict, right?
That's an interesting question because mediation is so complex, right? You need the third party to agree to being a mediator, and then you also need both of the countries that are fighting to agree to who that mediator is, right?
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of research that looks at kind of where mediation happens and what are the circumstances that encourage mediation, and a lot of that work shows these kind of trajectories in mediation. There are some conflicts or crises that are kind of really attractive to third party mediators and really
Mm.
open to mediation. And so I think in the case of Yugoslavia, there was something like 70 mediated ceasefires that happened there. I mean, none of them were upheld for more than 24 hours, but it was kind of like a hot conflict for mediation. And a lot of kind of the attractiveness of third parties to the disputants themselves depends on their relationship to that third party. There's kind of an interesting push-pull that happens here, where there might be a third party that's really attractive to one side, but not attractive to another. And so there's like mediator bias that might be at play. But one of the things that we find is that these third parties that are biased when they do mediate are actually really great at getting an agreement because they have those ties with one of the sides. They're able to convince them to agree to something that they might not otherwise agree to, or maybe offer side payments or something like that.
Mm.
And the power and the profile of the mediator and its ties to one of the sides can be something that makes them an attractive mediator to one side and maybe take some convincing on the part of the other side. But then they're much more likely to help reach an agreement if they do mediate.
I see, especially if they have an interest in resolving the conflict as well.
One of the interesting trends in mediation too that we've seen is a push for more female mediators. And so increasingly we're having kind of teams of mediators, especially when it's like the Norwegians that are going on, that include women who are helping to promote kind of including terms and peace agreements that acknowledge kind of women as victims of conflict and create programming for post-conflict opportunities, whether it's payments or victims' rights or truth and reconciliation commissions that can help acknowledge some of the ways that women are more likely to be victimized during violence.
So I read that mediation generally resolves conflicts faster, and then I guess the other way you would judge it was that they're generally more lasting resolutions as well.
I would say they're more lasting when it's a biased mediator because that mediator is helping to uphold that agreement, right? And so we know when there's a third party who's like really bought into a peace agreement and is maybe helping oversee that it's implemented, then they're more lasting. Kyle Beardsley, who's a professor at Duke, has done some work that shows that generally mediated outcomes are more likely to get an agreement, but that they don't last very long because if the mediator isn't there and engaged long term, they're more likely to fail in
Okay,
the years to come.
I see. Okay, yeah, that was sort of my next question along those lines. I know a lot of people try to jump on the first, like they say, "Oh, just accept this peace deal," but like if nobody's happy, you're just going to go back to fighting really quickly. So, are there best practices for getting a peace deal, but then also, maintaining that? Are there some strategies, some general trends that we see, some best practices for doing that?
Yeah, I would say one of the trends is that having a third party who's overseeing the implementation of an agreement and helping to guarantee that agreement is a really strong finding. And so, work by Paige Fortna, who's at Columbia, as well as others, has shown that when you have this kind of third party who's helping to uphold that agreement through either threats or promises or whatever means is necessary, you're much more likely to see that being upheld. So I'm very interested in the negotiations in Colombia that ended the civil war between the government and FARC and that peace agreement. And so one of the interesting things about the Colombian case is the Colombian government actually agreed to having Notre Dame oversee their implementation of the peace agreement. And so the team at the Peace Accord Matrix at Notre Dame actually publishes reports and gives them like grades on how much of the peace accord has actually been implemented and how they're doing. And so it's not a state that's overseeing that peace agreement, although the US has certainly been involved. It's actually a university and a bunch of academics that are saying you guys are doing this well, and you need to really work on, things like rural development that were also a promise in that agreement.
I see. That seems like almost an ultimate unbiased mediator there. Just
Yeah,
pure
right.
academic. Okay. I found a quote from one of your papers, and it said, "Peace does not rest on the shoulders of a single peacemaker, and nor does violence." So this is kind of a broad question, but like when you're negotiating peace, you have leaders that are negotiating, but it has to be accepted by the countries, the population. There's all sorts of competing political powers within countries. In the US, if the president is something, most things still have to be approved by Congress. So I was just wondering, like, how that works in terms of political systems. I saw that there's not a big difference between negotiations between democratic and authoritarian countries. Just the underlying power structures are kind of the same in upholding this. I don't know. I don't know how to think about this. It's kind of a broad question.
One way to think about it, and I guess for this question, I'm more thinking about civil wars and conflict within or violence within a state. And so thinking about it's not just kind of the leaders of a violent movement that have to implement any peace agreement. And so a lot of times in civil wars, we see kind of the leaders of a rebel group who will agree to a peace deal. They'll get some kind of, amnesty or sweet position in the new government or whatever.
Yeah.
And then kind of the rank and file members are left to kind of deal with the shambles of rebuilding a life that isn't necessarily one that's you know built on their skill set, especially when we're looking at like second generation rebels who were born into rebel camps and possibly illiterate and don't have kind of transferable skills necessarily at the ready to engage in legal commerce. And so I've gotten really interested in kind of what is the nature of that transition process like at the local level. There are some peace agreements that have this kind of formal demobilization program that helps people to reintegrate from rebel life. They may have things like in the Colombian case, there was actually like a cash payment to all of the former FARC members that was seed money for starting your new life. Also, a lot of times there are kind of housing camps for these former rebels to help them kind of transition to legal lifestyle. And so looking at kind of how do you get that buy-in from kind of rank and file members is really complicated depending on what kind of programs are implemented in the peace process. And so some of the ongoing research that I have with a Colombian scholar, Santiago Sosa, and a postdoc who's at St. Andrews right now, Alyssa D'Amico, looks at kind of the nature of peace agreements and how is it that kind of what's written in that peace agreement, is it providing kind of public goods like economic development and kind of these like shiny things that might buy off kind of a general public, or is it including private goods that would help kind of in the short term ensure these people who were carrying guns and trying to kill people lay down their guns and find a job that's legal? And so that kind of short-term incentive that these kind of private goods for ex-combatants is really necessary to create peace, and ensure a peace agreement is upheld and that there aren't kind of spoiler groups that spin off where we have kind of renewed violence. I think another way to think about it, and the book I'm working on right now is right along the lines of this topic. So there's a lot that I could say about it. Is kind of how do you create these contacts between different groups that were fighting before. And so, how do you create this kind of opportunity for interaction and socialization so that individuals stop seeing other individuals as the other, if you will? And so some of the research I've done in Northern Ireland on private community organizations looks at how these community organizations that have been created are often created along sectarian lines. And so they're actually encouraging more violence because you're
Mm,
only interacting with people that are, part of your side, if you will. And so it's actually creating more divisions among society instead of creating peace. And so creating opportunities for people to interact with the other is one way that you can create this kind of long-term peace and ensure that there's kind of implementation, and also creates circumstances that prevent violence, as well as crime. And so oftentimes there's kind of a spike in crime that goes along with a peace accord because criminalization of things that were once considered part of a war is common.